You've seen the movies and the documentaries, invincible German Panzers rolling across Europe in a flawless mechanical wave. It's not your fault you bought into the Hollywood myth of superior engineering. The truth is buried in 80-year-old maintenance logs. The system bought strategic presence at a severe physical cost, where over-engineered steel destroyed their own supply lines. I dug through these archives to rank every mass-produced German tank, skipping half-tracks and paper projects. And hey, I am only human, so if I miss a specific subvariant, correct me in the comments. Let's look at the raw steel. Chapter 1. The Pre-War Illusion. Before the brutal industrial reality of 1941, the system relied on high-speed fragility. Let's look at the early light tanks. The Panzer I. Let's be brutally honest. Paper specs classified this as a combat vehicle, but it was an agricultural tractor with a 13mm steel shell. It had 2 machine guns and armor so thin that a heavy rifle could cause a severe operational bottleneck. The crews were shoved into a metal box with zero survivability, treated as an acceptable administrative loss in early campaigns. Yet, this brutal simplification gave the German military exactly what it needed: a cheap, scalable platform to train thousands of men. The system didn't need a heavy brawler in 1939. It needed raw numbers to test the operational logic of armored warfare. It was a terrible tank, but a brilliant institutional stepping stone. Then came the Panzer II. I look at this as a classic bureaucratic panic reaction. When the heavier designs fell behind schedule, the administration needed a quick filler to maintain unit strength. They slapped a 20mm autocannon onto a slightly larger chassis. By the time they hit Russia, even with upgraded 30mm plates, it faced massive operational exposure against actual anti-tank weapons. The commander still had to fire the gun and direct the tank simultaneously, but logistically, it kept the machine moving. It was highly reliable and easy to maintain in the field. More importantly, every single one had a radio. The system realized that coordinated communication was often more lethal than raw firepower. It filled the gaps perfectly when the supply chain had nothing else to offer. The Panzer 35T was foreign hardware drafted into German service. It had a respectable 37mm gun, but the institutional reality quickly caught up with it. The pneumatic transmission and steering systems were wildly over-engineered for the brutal administrative reality of the Eastern Front. In freezing temperatures, the airlines simply froze and snapped. The operational uptime plummeted, turning them into static pillboxes or abandoned metal. However, for the early campaigns in France, they were an absolute logistical gift. The German system simply couldn't produce enough of their own medium tanks in 1940. Absorbing these Czechoslovak factories provided immediate operational mass at zero research cost. The Panzer 38T was another foreign acquisition. Looking at the design, the riveted armor was a massive institutional flaw. When struck by non-penetrating hits, the interior rivets sheared off and bounced around the cabin. It created a severe physical burden for the crews. Furthermore, the commander still had to manually crank the turret, making target acquisition under stress a frustratingly slow administrative process. But let me tell you, the maintenance depots loved this thing. The engine and suspension were incredibly reliable, offering an operational uptime that early native German designs struggled to match. It was so mechanically sound that the system kept building tank destroyers on this exact chassis long after the tank itself became tactically obsolete. So, looking at the early light tanks, the Panzer I was vulnerable training gear, the Panzer II acted as a stopgap measure, and the 38T proved to be a reliable asset. But the system needed a real backbone. Chapter 2. The Administrative Backbone. This brings us to the medium tanks and assault guns, the machines that actually carried the logistical weight of the war. The Panzer III is where German armored doctrine actually materialized. It introduced a brilliant 3-man turret layout. The commander was finally freed from firing the gun and could actually direct the battle. Add in a smooth torsion bar suspension and an internal intercom. For early war operational scale, this was a masterpiece of tactical management. But its greatest strength hid a fatal administrative flaw. The turret ring was strictly limited by the chassis width. When the army desperately needed bigger guns to fight heavier Soviet armor, the Panzer III simply couldn't accept anything larger than a 50mm, or a low-velocity 75mm. The institutional ceiling was hit hard. By 1943, this tactical foundation was stripped of its turret and repurposed for secondary duties. Let's look at the Sturmgeschütz 3, or Stug 3. On paper, losing a rotating turret is a severe tactical bottleneck. If you get flanked, the entire machine has to pivot to acquire the target. It forced the driver and gunner into a slow, frustrating operational coordination when reacting to sudden threats. For the crew, it severely limited their situational awareness. But from a purely administrative standpoint, it was an absolute masterpiece. Removing the turret removed complex machinery, drastically cutting production man-hours. It lowered the physical profile, creating minimal operational exposure. And crucially, losing the turret ring meant this exact same Panzer III chassis could suddenly mount a lethal, long-barreled 75mm gun. It became the most cost-effective system in the entire German arsenal. Then we have the Panzer IV. This was the true institutional workhorse. It was the only German tank produced continuously from the first day of the war to the last. The hull was spacious enough to accept constant systemic adaptations, easily upgrading from a short infantry support gun to a high-velocity anti-tank weapon. For the quartermasters, this consistency was a logistical dream. But by 1944, that dream became a mathematical nightmare. The system kept bolting on thicker armor plates and heavy side skirts to counter new threats. The basic leaf spring suspension was never designed for this massive physical burden. The front road wheels essentially collapsed under the operational weight, ruining its cross-country mobility. The administration squeezed every drop of utility out of the chassis until it structurally failed. The Panzer III provided the tactical foundation. The Stug 3 was incredibly cost-effective, and the Panzer IV remained the versatile system workhorse. But the bureaucracy started panicking. Chapter 3. The Mathematical Nightmare. They abandoned reliable mass production. Instead, they started chasing heavy, over-engineered miracles that destroyed their own infrastructure. The Panther was the system's attempt to leap into the future. On paper, it was a masterpiece. Sloped armor for maximum protection, and a high-velocity 75mm gun that could punch through anything. I see the industrial logic here. They wanted a machine that could dominate at long ranges, keeping their armored assets away from immediate physical risk. It was sleek, modern, and theoretically superior to every Allied medium tank. But the administration rushed it into production before the mechanical math was solved. The final drives were a disaster, sometimes failing after just 150 kilometers. The interleaved road wheels were an engineering nightmare. If an inner wheel was damaged, the crew had to remove 5 outer ones just to reach it. This created a massive maintenance bottleneck in the field. The system prioritized ballistic perfection over operational uptime, and the result was a machine that spent more time in the repair shop than on the map. Then there's the Tiger I. This wasn't just a tank, it was a psychological tool of the high command. With its 88mm gun and 100mm of flat frontal armor, it created a sense of tactical invincibility. For a while, the system enjoyed a period of total dominance. I've looked at the reports. The mere mention of a Tiger was enough to cause operational paralysis in enemy ranks. It was an elite administrative asset designed to break the heaviest resistance. But the logistical burden was staggering. The system utilized the complex, overlapping road wheel design that created a fatal operational flaw in the winter. Mud and snow would pack densely between the wheels during the day and drop to freezing temperatures overnight, literally freezing the 57-ton tank in place. On top of that, it was so wide it couldn't fit on standard rail cars without manually changing its tracks every time it moved. The fuel consumption was an economic catastrophe, and the sheer weight meant most bridges were off limits. The system built a predator that practically anchored itself to the frozen mud and nearest supply depot. The Tiger II was the ultimate expression of the mathematical nightmare. It possessed the most lethal anti-tank gun of the war, and frontal armor that was virtually immune to any direct fire. In a static defensive position, it was an unbeatable institutional wall. From my research, when these machines were actually operational, they could hold entire sectors of the front through sheer firepower alone. It was the peak of armored evolution. But the mechanical price was fatal. The 70-ton weight pushed the engine and transmission far beyond their design limits. I found logs where these tanks were abandoned, not because of enemy fire, but because the drivetrain simply disintegrated under the load. It was an administrative delusion to think a retreating army could support a machine this demanding. By 1945, the Tiger II was essentially a mobile fortress that ran out of fuel and mechanical luck before it even reached the engagement zone. Panther's weight strained its drives. Tiger I required constant intensive care, and Tiger II was limited by its extreme mass. The system was failing. Chapter 4. The Final Desperation. The system collapsed. They stopped building balanced armies and started building desperate institutional patches. Welcome to the tank destroyers and super heavies. The Martyr series was pure institutional panic on tracks. I look at these designs and see a severe physical burden placed on the crews. They took obsolete Panzer II and 38T chassis and bolted heavy anti-tank guns on top. It had a massive profile and offered zero overhead protection. Artillery shrapnel and harsh weather caused constant operational interruptions. It was a glass cannon in the most literal sense, but logistically, it was a brilliant adaptation. It immediately solved the anti-tank bottleneck without requiring the administration to design a new chassis from scratch. They squeezed lethal firepower out of obsolete metal. The Jagdpanzer IV was supposed to be the sleek, enclosed successor to the Stug. I see the initial design as a masterclass in reducing operational exposure. With extremely sloped armor and a reliable 75mm L-48 gun, it was a perfectly optimized administrative tool for the ambush tactician. It could hide easily in tree lines and strike with brutal efficiency without straining the underlying chassis. But then, administrative panic crashed into physical reality. The system demanded they mount the massive, long-barreled 75mm gun from the Panther, creating the Panzer IV/70 variant. That oversized weapon pushed all the weight to the front, essentially collapsing the forward suspension under the structural imbalance. The crews called this overloaded version Guderian's Duck. It became so nose-heavy that steering in deep mud turned into an absolute mechanical nightmare. Then I found the maintenance records for the Hetzer. It was cramped beyond belief. The gun had terrible traverse to the right, meaning the driver had to constantly shift the entire vehicle to track targets. The commander sat completely isolated in the back, practically blind. It was a claustrophobic trap for the crew, built purely to satisfy factory quotas. Yet the bureaucracy loved it. It was incredibly cheap, utilized the old reliable 38T components, and possessed excellent frontal armor geometry. It flooded the shrinking front with inexpensive defensive points. It was the absolute perfect bureaucratic weapon for a collapsing nation. Which brings me to the Elephant. They took Porsche's failed Tiger chassis and repurposed it into a massive tank destroyer. With 200mm of frontal armor and an 88mm gun, it was an unstoppable fortress. At Kursk, from an operational distance, these things obliterated enemy armor before they could even return fire. The ultimate institutional sledgehammer. But the over-engineered petrol-electric drive was a mechanical black hole, and famously, the initial design lacked a hull machine gun. Enemy infantry exploited this tactical blindness, placing explosives right in its blind spots. It was a 65-ton logistical disaster that often caught fire just trying to climb a minor hill. I consider the Jagdpanther the actual peak of German tank destroyer design. The administration finally got the formula right. They took the reliable sloped armor concept of the Panther and mounted the devastating 88mm gun of the King Tiger. It offered an incredible balance of mobility, protection, and lethal tactical reach. But its brilliance was buried under systemic failure. It still inherited the Panther's fragile final drives, requiring constant mechanical babysitting. More importantly, the system's industrial capacity was so degraded by Allied bombing that they could barely produce enough of them to equip a few battalions. It was a perfect operational asset, built in mathematically irrelevant numbers. Looking at the Jagdtiger archives, you see pure administrative delusion. It carried a 128mm gun and 250mm of frontal armor. In a pure mathematical vacuum, it was untouchable. It could engage targets at distances where return fire was physically meaningless. It was an absolute denial of area weapon. The reality? It weighed 71 tons. The Tiger II chassis was already failing at 68 tons, so this was an engineering death sentence. The operational uptime was comically low. Crews abandoned and destroyed more of their own vehicles due to transmission failure and lack of fuel than were ever lost to enemy action. It was a bunker that couldn't support its own tactical weight. Finally, the Mouse. 188 tons of pure institutional madness. It was physically too heavy to cross conventional bridges, meaning it had to snorkel through rivers powered by an electrical cable attached to a second Mouse on the bank. Its sheer size turned it into a massive operational vulnerability from aerial attacks. The logistical footprint was impossible to sustain. Yet, looking at the late-war production spreadsheets, I understand the twisted logic. The system had lost the war of volume. Their only desperate administrative play was to try and win the war of absolute physical quality, building a mobile fortress for a defensive stand. It was a paper fantasy forced into steel. The Hetzer trapped its crews, the Jagdtiger destroyed its own transmission, and the Mouse was a pure bureaucratic fantasy. So, after analyzing all these files, here are my 3 main takeaways. First, the German administrative machine was fatally obsessed with perfect paper specifications, completely ignoring the physical reality of the battlefield. Planners in Berlin designed theoretical masterclasses in ballistics and armor geometry, but they willfully ignored the brutal variables of deep mud, frozen airlines, and shattered supply chains. They engineered machines for an idealized war that didn't exist, proving that absolute mechanical perfection is entirely useless if your tank sinks into a field or runs out of fuel before firing a single shot. Second, the true institutional value of an armored vehicle has nothing to do with the size of its main gun. The best tank of the war wasn't some 70-ton behemoth. It was the machine that actually started up in the morning and could be manufactured by the thousands. Vehicles like the Panzer IV and the Stug III carried the real operational weight because they offered tactical availability. A decent, reliable asset that your factories can stamp out infinitely will always outmaneuver an isolated mechanical miracle. And third, while I can look at the raw schematics and admire the sheer ambition of these machines, I genuinely pity the mechanics who had to deal with this administrative fallout. Imagine being a frontline technician in the middle of a freezing Russian winter, forced to remove 5 overlapping, mud-frozen steel road wheels just to reach a broken internal axle on a Panther. The high command traded basic human operational comfort for complex engineering puzzles, turning every maintenance depot into a living nightmare. That is what the archives show me. But I want to hear your logic. Which of these machines do you think was the absolute biggest steal? Let me know in the comments.